All right, so I'm looking at that Asaro head on the right. I'm blocking out the top of the head and bottom of the chin with some markers there, with some lines. And then with a red line, I'll block out the eye line. Now this head, we're looking slightly up at this head, so my eye line is a little higher than halfway. Then I'll get the brow line, which is just above it. All these tools I explained in chapter 1. And then evenly down for the nose, or something roughly even. Again, we're looking a little bit up at this head, so these won't be perfect measurements. But this is just a block in. I will always modify my drawing as I go. Just putting down, this is not even really a value. I'm just kind of defining my work area. It's kind of a habit that I have. I don't like drawing straight in with dark lines. I like to have some kind of texture there. Just a personal preference. Anyway, now I'm using my guidelines and landmarks to just rough in the head, and I'm just using whatever tools I need to block it in. Everyone will be different. I like the glabella a lot. I like the underplane of the nose. These are planes that I find easy to draw. And I just kind of search around in the beginning for these landmarks, and then like a puzzle, as these landmark pieces start coming together, it's easy for me to draw the rest of it. It becomes easier and easier as you kind of construct the head one piece after the next. So with chapter 1's fundamental knowledge of the planes, their placements, their overall orientation, and how they're all assembled, you can begin to define your own preferred process of constructing the head. There's no right or wrong in terms of which order you choose to put things in, as long as things end up in the right place. So, there should be nothing mysterious here, assuming you've seen chapter 1 of this lesson. I'm using the cheekbones here to define a large part of the forward-facing part of the head. I'm using the side plane of the brow. I'm using, the area of the eye sockets where the brow turns under. Just some basic, using the jaw, the side planes of the jaw, just to determine those front and side planes of the box. That's usually what I'm interested in now. Now I'm getting into the nose, because the nose, again, is very box-like, so it's easy to determine the front and side planes. I'm not going for perfect accuracy yet. I mean, I'd like this to eventually end up accurate, and I'll make sure my block-in is as accurate as I can get it. But I'm always for refining as you go. So don't worry, don't get hung up on making sure your drawing is perfect before you start painting. In fact, a big part of painting is there's a sculptural aspect to painting. I mean, that's kind of what you're doing with painting, is you are sculpting with values. So a large part of finding those forms and refining them is better off left for the painting process itself. So with my line drawing, I just want to make sure it's accurate enough. And your level of accuracy may vary. Sometimes I will go for things that are not even really accurate, and I'll find the accuracy in the painting. In this case, I want something fairly accurate. After all, this is a lesson on understanding the head, and it would be a little disingenuous of me to start with something totally rough. And here comes the structure of the eye, specifically the eye that's in light. Remember my value scheme where the shadows are just reduced to one value, so I'm not going to have to worry with the eye on the left too much in this study. So I'll make sure the eye on the right has a lot of information on it, because there's a lot of light and shadow there. And then on the left, I'll put something in just to make sure it's constructionally sound, but I'm not going to worry about its planes too much, because this will just end up, in this study, this is going to just end up in one value in shadow anyway. So I'll put a few basic planes in there, just again to convince myself that it's kind of ready to go. Look around the head, see what other planes might need a little touching up, little rhythms you want to put in there and correct before you start. Okay, now I'm going to plot out my two values, average light, average shadow. There they are. I'll select average shadow and just start painting in wherever there's shadow, following the exact same logic as I just showed you with the sphere in the last section. It does not matter to me if it's a form shadow or a cast shadow, like the nose here is casting a shadow onto the face. That's just a shadow. It's going to merge right in there with the form shadows. For instance, the shadow here on the upper lip, it's caused by a plane change or a form change, so we call it a form shadow. As long as it's a shadow, it gets one value. You notice I'm not trying to be perfect with that value. Like it doesn't need to be like a posterized value. You could just make a big selection and just fill bucket tool, but I'm just using a brush and working with one value. If I happen to make minor variations of that value, I'm not too worried. But I'm not trying to model anything with subtle values. I've picked one value, I'm painting with one value, and that is what I'm doing. And I'll just work all across the head. As long as it's in shadow, I'll use that one value. I'm trying to make hard edges too. I'm not trying to make soft edges. I'll show you the soft edge process a little later. We'll start into that in this lesson, but just work with hard edges for now. That's the nice thing about understanding the head via planes, is that planes reduce all the softness. They make it into just hard. Everything is hard-edged. Now, that's not true of reality, but when it comes to your fundamental understanding, that's why planes are so useful. It removes the extraneous, and we're just understanding things, in this case, with hard-edged shapes, hard borders between the planes. My initial line drawing, by the way, is on a multiply layer on top of this, so I can still see my lines through this. I will eventually flatten those and amalgamate them so my lines disappear. But just to start your block in, it's nice to have that line layer as reference, which is also why I tried to make it somewhat accurate. Now, the value you pick for average light, average shadow, it doesn't really matter. Like, there's no such thing as a correct shadow value. The only thing that makes a shadow value correct is that it's darker than the light. And what I recommend is that you just leave yourself a lot of contrast. You notice if you look at my values there on the top left, I've made sure there's a lot of contrast on them. They separate to a great degree. There's a lot of room later on for me to put a halftone somewhere in there. So just keep your lights and shadows separate. That's what I really recommend for these studies. And not only for these studies, for paintings in general, but especially when you're first learning, I really recommend giving yourself a lot of contrast to work with. That will give you the best and most clear results. All right, so I'm still working away with the average shadow value, and you notice I'm refining my drawing as I go, like changing little contours and little forms and planes. It's all fair game, like refine as you go. That's what you should be doing. And I've probably flattened my layers by now, so I can erase my line drawing and just put a value over it. I'm all for refining as you go. I really, really don't think it's beneficial or even useful to try and get everything perfect with each step. You simply won't be able to do that with any degree of reliability. Whereas being free to change things and not being afraid of making mistakes, then, accepting the fact that you'll probably have to change things later will give you the impetus to just kind of get in there and start moving these values around. Now, the planes that are in shadow should be predictable. It's the planes that are facing away from the light. That's why it's so nice to understand the head in planes, which of course is what chapter 1 was all about, because the planes that turn dramatically away from the light are going to be in shadow. So it's very predictable when you look at the Asaro head, in this case, we can see it on the right, or when you're inventing a head from your imagination. If you know the directions that these planes face, you can easily move your light source around, knowing that when the plane turns away from the light, it will be in the shadow family. And if a plane faces the light, it will be in the light family. This is how a painter understands the world, with changes in direction of plane matched up with the direction of a light source. That's the key information a painter needs. Okay, so what I'm going to do now that I'm finished with the shadow is I'm just going to put in average light. Now this is just silly easy. Anything that's not the shadow, which I've already defined, I'm putting in average light. In theory, I didn't even have to do this step. I could have just used the value of the canvas that was already there, but I like when the head is a little bit darker than the canvas. Also, it gives me yet another chance to refine what's there. I might sample my shadow like I'm doing here and just adjust the shape of it and go back to my average light and keep putting that in. It gives me yet another stage for quality control. So let me just quickly get this value in here. And just like with the shadows, I'm keeping my edges hard. I'm not painting a human here. I'm painting the Asaro head, which has, hard planes. You can work this way with a human as well, but we'll get into that. Anyway, bear with me while I just finish up the average light stage. Just refining things here and there, getting those rhythms in where I need them. And at this point, let's put in a halftone. So I'm going to add a value to my little list. Halftone. Remember that a halftone is in the light family, so I like to bias the halftone lighter rather than darker. Don't just split the difference between average light and average shadow. Make the halftone closer to the light. Remember, the most important thing is to keep the lights and shadow families separate so they don't fight. So a halftone and the average light are both light values. Think of them as brother and sister. Keep those siblings together. They are in the same family. So I'm looking at the Asaro head, and it's pretty clear to see the planes that are, slightly turning away from the light. The light is coming from above pretty clearly, right? So any plane that faces slightly under or turning around to the side or what have you is going to get a slightly darker value. And again, you can visually just spot them on the Asaro head reference there. Notice, just like the sphere in the last section, those halftones have different values depending on the exact orientation of the plane. But I am not looking at that. I am only looking for the fact that it's a halftone. And if it's a halftone, it's getting that one average halftone value. Again, this is a structural choice. And also, again, you can add complexity to this later. I don't want you to think that you can't use multiple halftone values. But when you're first learning, and even if you're a professional artist, you can limit your halftones to one. I've done many paintings where even in my final painting, I only am using one halftone value. That largely comes down to an aesthetic choice, a stylistic choice. If I'm creating multiple halftone values here, it's incidental. It's just because I'm using a brush with, pen pressure, and I'm a imperfect human being, so my pressure is not always the same. So if I'm creating different values, that is purely incidental. You should not be reading into that. I could have just selected this and fill bucketed tool everything. But I decided to go in with a brush because that helps me draw better. I can make revisions, like I said, as I go. So I'm just looking at these rhythms. And the other thing to keep in mind when you paint, painting has a very qualitative difference to drawing. In that painting, I'm grouping planes together. That goes hand in hand with grouping values together. Like every plane that's in shadow gets one value. That inherently means that I don't have to draw all the planes that we learned in section 1. Now, intellectually, I know where they are. I know that they're there. So if I had to, I could audit my work with my knowledge that we got in chapter 1 of this whole video lesson. But in painting, I'm largely discarding most of that. I don't need to indicate every plane. I'm grouping them together. This is also the nature of simplification. You take a lot of knowledge and you represent it broadly. Another way to say that is you're very conscious of what you're not showing the viewer, because what you're not showing the viewer still has to be correctly placed. For instance, I still have to have a difference between the jaw and the cheek, even though those areas are both in the same shadow value. I still have to know where they are, because otherwise, how can I be sure if I'm, painting it correctly? Painting is largely a problem of drawing. So in chapter 1 of this lesson, Understanding the Head, we looked at the head mostly from like a drawing perspective. Now we're shifting gears and looking at the head from a painting perspective. And one important difference happens here when you make that shift. The two-dimensional shapes you make when you group values together really start to matter. Like I've grouped, if you look at the shadows of this painting, I've grouped the brow, the eye socket, the side of the nose, the jaw, the lip. All of them are connected in one big shadow shape. That shape is important. That shape needs to be drawn simply and well, because now not only does that shadow represent multiple planes, it is part of the design of your painting, like the two-dimensional design. So painting is this interesting hybrid which takes a lot of three-dimensional understanding, but represented with simple two-dimensional hieroglyphs. Okay, let's use this as an opportunity to take our value lesson one step further. This is something I did not cover in the sphere lesson a moment ago. I'm adding one more value, and no surprise, it's a value in the light, because again, light is where we see the most information. So this value will help us model the form even more. You can think of this value as kind of like a reverse halftone. Halftones were planes that were turning away from the light. Well, these planes are the planes that most directly face the light, or planes that are maybe perpendicular to the light source. They are going to receive the full brunt of that light, and therefore are going to get a little lighter. Again, this light value is not necessary, but it's something you can add to your painting as a way to model the form even more, and restrict that modeling to the light area where we want the most information. So I'll be very careful here. I'm thinking about planes that are directly facing the light. So this part of the upper lip, the maxilla area, quite directly faces the light when it's coming from this particular angle. And you notice that upper lip value is connected in with the side plane of the nose. Just like I connected my shadow values, I connect my light values. I try and maximize the amount of visual connection I make in my paintings as a design principle. It makes for the most clearly readable paintings. You want to take your knowledge of all these little individual planes and group them into shapes that are clearly readable. It's very tempting to keep all these planes very separate, because your knowledge, you're like, oh, I know all these little planes, I want to separate them all. And you can become very precious or proud about your knowledge, and you want to show everyone everything you know. Go the opposite way. Group them together. That will give the viewer an easily sort of digestible version of the light, and generally makes for paintings that just read a whole lot better. Okay, to add yet another stage of complexity, let's go and soften some edges. This is something you can't really look at the Asaro head for, because the Asaro head only delivers hard edges. But I'm just taking, in this case, my smudge tool in Photoshop, or you can use a soft brush or whatever tool you like to soften things or blend things. And I'm just softening edges to various degrees. And I'm trying to use some knowledge of like the forms itself. It's like if it's a bony form like the side of the brow or the ridge of the nose, I'll use a harder edge. If it's a fleshy form like the nasolabial furrow, like the laugh line, or the lips, I might use a softer edge. We'll look at edges more in future demonstrations, but I just want to get into it very quickly here in a very rudimentary way, just to show you the difference between hard and soft. It can give your Asaro head knowledge a more fleshy kind of feel. Because after all, human beings are not made of perfectly hard edges all the time. So in chapter 2 here, in painting the head, we want to start broaching the topic of edge control. And in this stage, I'm not being too technical about it. I'm just exploring with various degrees of softening the edge. We'll look at more paintings and more reference in depth in the next few demos, and I'll discuss, why things are softer and how soft I'm going to make it. Here, I'm just playing around. Playing around with some various soft edges. Again, mostly just thinking if the form is more bony, I'll keep it harder. If it's more fleshy, I'll keep it softer. Oh, I'm also fixing the eye. I noticed that eye was just a little small looking. But here's the nice thing about having a structure that works. I can change little things. Like if that eye was feeling too small, changing it or moving it or doing whatever you have to do, the surgery you have to do to it, is not going to cause huge aches and pains on your end because the structure is there. I said earlier in chapter 1 that the structure is far more important than the features. And this is why. Within good structure, I could make that eye a little bit bigger and it's fine. It just fits right in the structure. I've allowed for it. Whereas, if the structure of the head weren't there, changing something like that, even a little bit, would cause, gigantic ripple effects, and it would be an overall nightmare. And, just like that, a few more refinements, but there is our finished Asaro head value study. A very helpful way to start bridging the gap between drawing and painting. All right, let's move on.